So thank you for everyone for being here, both throughout the state on our WebEx and here in headquarters. As you all know, January is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And so it's a very important month for us to really honor the victims in California and throughout our nation, and to do our best to try and prevent this crime from being perpetrated. Opening Doors is a nonprofit organization that helps refugees, survivors of human trafficking, and other underserved victims throughout the Sacramento area. They have help achieve self-sufficiency and increase assets by accessing opportunities to mainstream economic, legal, and social systems. They do this by providing a safe place, by providing skill development, business training, loans, immigrant and legal assistance, and connections to community resources. So today our guest speaker is Elizabeth Medina. She got her bachelor's degree in social work in the Los Angeles area, and she's pursued opportunities both domestically and abroad, working with street children and communities affected by HIV. Elizabeth graduated with her master's in social work in community organization from the University of Michigan. Her focus of her work has been on immigrant victims of domestic violence and other crimes affecting immigrants. She currently works at Opening Doors, providing case management services to survivors of human trafficking and providing education and outreach to the community on this tragic issue. So Elizabeth, please come up and join us.
Thank you for having me here today. So just a disclaimer before we get started. The training that you are going to receive is from the perspective of a victim advocate. So like it was mentioned previously, I'm the person who assists the victim in filling out the CalVCP application. And so I'm thrilled to be here and to be able to have this training today with both the people here presently and all the people who are watching online. So as it was mentioned with Opening Doors, some of the things that we do include work directly with survivors of human trafficking and also assisting with the resettlement of refugees. We also have financial capability programs where we teach people how to navigate the American financial system. And then we also have a micro enterprise program that assists people with either starting or maintaining a small business. And the training today is made possible through the Sacramento Rescue and Restore Coalition and the Rescue and Restore program nationwide, which seeks to network and to connect various organizations that are involved in anti-trafficking, both here in the region and nationally. And the purpose is to build awareness in order to identify and serve more victims of trafficking. Some of the goals for our training today include definitions and a common understanding of what is human trafficking, a more in-depth look at who are the traffickers and who are the victims that are being affected, being able to identify a victim of trafficking in comparison to victims of other crimes that we see, the hurdles for survivors, some case examples, the services that are available to these victims, as well as immigration relief options, and then an opportunity for question and answer. So now we're moving on to some terms and definitions. So in the anti-trafficking world, there are very specific terms that are used, and the language is evolving, ever evolving in terms of the language that we use to describe the population that we serve. So the overarching term that we use to describe human trafficking covers a broad range. It looks at slavery on a global level. It encompasses sex trafficking, labor trafficking, youth, adults, children. It encompasses everything that we know to be human trafficking is encompassed in that term. Anti-trafficking are all the efforts that are made to combat or to address this issue. So often I get people that come up to me after a presentation and say, oh, I want to get involved in human trafficking. And I kind of pause and I'm like, no, you don't. You want to get involved in anti-trafficking. And so there's a distinction that's made there. And we really emphasize language because this legislation, this issue has really come to the forefront of our mind in the past 10 years. And so we're really just still developing language and models to really address this issue. Another term is DMST, or domestic minor sex trafficking, and that encompasses people who are domestic. They are born in the United States, they are minors, they are under the age of 18, and they are involved in the commercial sex industry and are being victimized in sex trafficking. And commercial sexual exploitation, that is where something of value is given in exchange for the sexual act or encounter. CSEC is a synonym or another word that is used for DMST, and so that is the commercial sexual exploitation of children. That is another term that is used. And foreign national or foreign born is what is used to describe immigrants, people who are coming from other countries to the United States and then are trafficked or victimized here. So, if all these terms are very confusing, that's okay. We're going to go into more of what this looks like in just a second. So now, what is human trafficking? So we look at the federal definition. The California definition has some additional components to it, but looking at the federal definition, it is the commercial sexual exploitation of an adult using force, fraud, or coercion, or the commercial sexual exploitation of a youth or a minor, someone being under the age of 18 years old. Or it can be forced labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion, including involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So all of you should have a handout. And for those who are watching online, it's the model that's on your screen about what is human trafficking. So this model was developed that looks at action, means, and purpose. And looking at the definition of human trafficking, it's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, and obtainment of a person using force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercial sex or labor. So we're going to break down what each one of these means. And in order to look at a case of human trafficking, as a victim advocate, I look at, do they have at least one element? Do they have at least one aspect of their case that meets an action, a means, or purpose? So, and each of these looks very different depending on the case that we have, depending on the individual that's coming forward. So a recruitment can look like a person who was in their country of origin and they saw a poster saying, we need actresses or models in the United States. You know, call this recruitment agency, find out more. So that could be a type of recruitment. It could be a person who is contacted by a distant relative in the United States and they say, you know, we have a great job for you, or you can come to school here, come over, and we're going to help you. That can be a form of recruitment. Recruitment can also be a young girl whose boyfriend convinces that he loves her and wants to be with her and they belong together and they're family, and that if she really loves him, then she'll sleep with his friends for money. So that can also be a recruitment tactic. Recruitment can be peers. It could be two young girls in a group home that one convinces the other to engage in the commercial sex industry. That is also a form of recruitment. So recruitment can look very different depending on the population that you're looking at or working with, or the individual whose case you're looking at. And then we come to harboring. Harboring can be a youth who is being kept in a motel where they're forced to have sex with various people in exchange so that their pimp or trafficker can get money. So that can be harboring. Harboring could be a person who is an immigrant and is being held in a residential brothel, so a house in the middle of a neighborhood that is used for the commercial sex industry where people are coming and going. This is also an example of harboring. Harboring could be an agricultural worker who is kept in a shed next to the fields where they harvest. That is also harboring. So again, these look very different depending on the type of case that we're looking at. So then we look at transportation. And often with transportation, we think international borders. A couple of years ago, we saw the movie Taken, and so we think often of international borders, and we think that that is what trafficking is. So I want to remind people that transportation is only one element of human trafficking. So if a person, they don't necessarily need to be transported in order to be a victim of trafficking. But when you do have transportation, it could be across international borders, it could be across state lines, it could be across city lines. And like I said, you can also have a person who has never left Sacramento, was born and raised here, and then convinced by their boyfriend to, have sex with other people in exchange so that their boyfriend or pimp or trafficker can get money. And that is also, that person is also a victim of trafficking, even though they never left that city where they were born and raised. So I know we think often transportation in terms of trafficking, but I really want to emphasize that it's only one element of the definition. And then we look at provision and obtainment. And the way that I think about provision and obtainment is with human trafficking, at the end of the day, it is a business. And so people are essentially commodified, and we see, is that person being provided to and obtained by multiple people? In the case of residential brothels, you have these women who are kept in these houses where men will come and go, and so you have people who are managing that house and collecting the money from the men or the consumers that come to that house. And so they are being provided to and obtained by multiple people. You have that person being used as a product and another person that is consuming that product. So then we come to means. Means is what are the things that are keeping that person in that situation? Often when we talk face-to-face with the victim, it's, why did you stay? Or what are the things that stopped you from leaving, right? So when it comes to means, we see three main forms that keep a person in that situation, and that is force, that is fraud, and that is coercion. Force is everything physical. It is physical abuse. It is physical confinement. I've had cases involving people who were kept on a ranch where there is security cameras and fences, and there's locks on these fences, and there's no way they can get out. So there's physical confinement that is involved with force. There's sexual assault. So many people think that with labor trafficking, that it's completely separate from sexual abuse or sexual assault. But often when we have labor trafficking, there's also some elements of sexual assault, some elements of sexual abuse. For example, I've had cases involving women who are forced to work in agriculture and pick in the fields, and if they didn't, they would be sexually assaulted at night by the people who were running these fields, these ranches. And so we see that often sexual abuse is used as a means to keep someone fearful and to keep someone in that situation. So we have physical abuse, we have sexual assault, we have physical confinement. These are examples of force. And then we have fraud. And fraud, we think about it in terms of what are the promises that are made to this person, and are those promises kept or are they not kept? So if we go back to recruitment, there's a lot of promises that are being made there. That person is told, come to the United States and you'll have a great life. Or, stay with me, I love you, I'm your family. There's always some type of promise that's being made. And so when we look at force, we look at, okay, is that promise being kept by that person who promised it, or is it not being kept? And in terms of labor, it can be very straightforward. In terms of this person was promised that they would be paid $10 an hour, and then they came to this country, and then they are being paid $2 an hour or $0 an hour, or they were paid their full wages in the beginning, but then the trafficker convinced them to come live where they were working, and then they stopped paying them. And it's been 8 years of no pay and slave-like conditions. So we see fraud being that hook that gets people in. Oftentimes there's promises of, oh, if you work for me, I'll get you papers, so I'll get you some type of legal status in the country. If you work for me, you'll have enough money to send back home to your family. Or, if you stay in this relationship, in the case of sex trafficking, oftentimes there is some form of relationship. And if you stay with me, you'll make money, you'll have nice things, you'll have the life that you always wanted. And so there's always some type of promise, some type of illusion that's made so that the victim stays in that situation. And it's this hope that if I just stick this out long enough, then things are going to get better, and I'll get whatever this person owes me, whatever this person promised me. So it's that fraud, it's like this hope that keeps that person also in that situation. And then we come to coercion. Coercion is all the psychological things that are done to a victim in order to keep them afraid to leave. And so coercion is often seen as threats. Threats of, if you tell the police what's going on, you're going to get deported. If you tell anyone what's going on with you, I'm going to make sure that I post it on Facebook so all of your friends will know that you're a hoe, will know that this is who you are. We've seen cases with domestic minor sex trafficking where they threaten them with posting these acts on Facebook, on Instagram, on social media. And if you're a teenager, social media is your life, and these are your friends, and you don't want your friends, your family, to know that this is what you're doing, even though you first got into this because your boyfriend convinced you that this is what you should do if you loved him. So the threats, the coercion is something that we see all the time. So threats to harm of reputation, threats of physical harm, even if that person is never harmed physically themselves, oftentimes they'll witness the abuse of other victims, and so that in itself becomes threatening. It's if you see someone get beat up day in and day out, you're not going to question what your trafficker, what your pimp, what this person says to you, because you've seen already what they've done to the person who disobeys them, who tries to run away. So coercion is a tool that is used to manipulate, to control, to psychologically keep that person afraid of leaving. And then we come to purpose. With human trafficking, there's always some type of purpose. There's always some type of money that is either made or some type of money that is saved through this business that is being run. So, for example, with the commercial sex industry, that is where, again, something of value is given in exchange for that commercial sex act. And so the pimp or the trafficker or the mama-san who is running a massage parlor will get thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And it's something that, in essence, it's a product that keeps on giving. And so there's a purpose, there's money that's being made. In terms of labor, a lot of times what they'll do is they won't pay or they'll underpay people working in the fields and restaurants and hotels, and they'll save a lot of money that they would have otherwise used if they used fair employment practices. And we can move on to the next slide. So what you'll see here is the middle is blocked out. And so everything that I've just described applies to adults on a federal level. So federally, to prosecute a case, you have to look at force, fraud, and coercion for an adult. That adult has to have some of those elements in their case in order to be able to go forward with prosecution. With a minor, we don't necessarily need to prove the force, fraud, and coercion because they are a minor, and they are legally not able to consent to sex under normal circumstances. So why should they be able to exchange, or why should they be able to consent when there's some type of money that's being exchanged. So the logic of the law says if you are under 18, we don't need to prove that you were forced, that there was fraud, or there was coercion. Does it help a case? Absolutely. But it's not necessary in order to go forward with prosecution. So the next slide you should see is about smuggling versus human trafficking. So again, oftentimes we get caught up on, did this person cross international borders? And oftentimes, most often, because I'm a person who works specifically with foreign nationals, almost all of my clients were in some type of smuggling situation. But there is a distinct difference between smuggling and human trafficking. A person who is smuggled generally is cooperating with what's going on. They understand, I'm paying this person to take me across the border. Once I get there, my family will pay the money, or I will pay the money, and I'm free to take whatever job I can. This is kind of the person who's being smuggled. This is their mentality. Oftentimes what happens with human trafficking is a person may start off being smuggled, but then once they get to the United States, they can't pay that smuggling debt. So they become very easy prey to a trafficker who says, oh, I'll pay your smuggling debt for you, but then I need you to work for me for 6 months in my restaurant, in my hotel, and this, that, or the other in order to pay me back. And that person, because they're already vulnerable in their situation, will agree to this type of arrangement, and then before long, they're realizing they're not able to pay their debt. They're being charged exorbitant amount for food, for rent, for those types of things, and they're not able to pay back their debt, and it becomes debt bondage. And so while there are differences between smuggling and human trafficking, it's very easy for a situation that started out as smuggling to become human trafficking. So just wanted to make that distinction. So where does trafficking occur? Oftentimes we have ideas that human trafficking happens at big national events. There was a lot of conversations in this year and the past year around the Super Bowl, around Indy 500, around these type of big national events. Human trafficking can occur in those types of instances, but most often the types of trafficking that we see here in California are more day-to-day types of things. In the labor industry, we see hospitality services, factories, sweatshops, construction, landscaping, even peddling and begging. I never had second thoughts about someone who's on the street with a sign that says needs money for food until I ran into a few different people that all had the same story. Oh, we need money for rent. And the more we engaged with them, the more we realized they were connected and they were all paying rent to the same individual, and they had to meet a quota of the number of dollars or the money that they would get from being out on the corner. And so peddling and begging can even become a form of human trafficking. We also see, for example, in the commercial sex industry, massage parlors and spas, residential brothels, escort services, exotic dancing, pornography, pickup trucks, truck stops, and then again, anyone who's under the age of 18 that's involved in the commercial sex industry is a victim of human trafficking because of the age of consent. And we think about who are the traffickers. Oftentimes we have an image in our head about who the traffickers are. We think about a pimp. We think about we have an image in our head of who we think the traffickers are. We think they're like the boogeyman who's in the bushes and waiting to snatch someone and, then force them into this type of situation. Having worked with victims, I can tell you that just as victims come in all shapes, sizes, ages, genders, so do traffickers. And so we've seen traffickers who are business owners. We've seen traffickers who are female. We've seen traffickers who are of all ages, traffickers that are teenagers themselves, traffickers who are older adults, highly respected in the community, well-educated. We've seen it all in terms of what traffickers can be like. And so just as it's difficult to pick out or to identify who the traffickers are, it's also at times difficult to decipher who is a victim and how do you know when you come across a victim in the first place. So we're going to move on to victim identification and some of the issues that can come with identifying a victim. So first I'm going to talk about labor trafficking, and you should have about 4 images on your screen. The first one depicts domestic servitude, and this at times is a very difficult form of human trafficking to identify. Why? Because it's in someone's home, right? Most oftentimes, it's a relative or someone who is convinced to come to the United States with the illusion or the promise that they're going to come and go to school or they're going to come and work, and then they end up being forced to cook, to clean, to take care of children, to do all of the domestic work for either a huge family. And in reality, they are not treated as a family member. They are treated as a slave within the home. So often they are forced to sleep in the garage, sleep in a closet. They are not treated as a family member or even as an employee. They are treated as less than human. And that is what constitutes a domestic servitude case. The other example next to that is of a person working in a restaurant. Oftentimes, we don't give a second thought to the people who are working in the kitchen of the restaurants that we frequent. And in seeing these cases, a lot of times what will happen is workers are recruited, usually by some type of fake recruitment company. They come to a city that they don't know. Their housing, their transportation is arranged by the restaurant owner. They'll usually cram around 10 to 15 young immigrant men in one studio apartment. The conditions are absolutely horrendous. And a lot of these men are then transported to and from the restaurant, not having any freedom to come and go as they please. And they are working 10 to 12 hours a day at around $3, $4 an hour. And oftentimes they're not allowed to keep any tips. They're not allowed to talk to people in general. And so they become very isolated and are subject to a lot of victimization and labor abuses. We also see trafficking in agriculture. Especially in the rural communities, agricultural workers can be very isolated, and so they have very little access to community resources, very little access, and also fear of law enforcement and telling people what's actually going on. The woman that I mentioned previously that was being sexually assaulted when she didn't work in the fields, it took her 10 years to get out of that situation and finally be able to talk to law enforcement about what happened to her. And then we also see labor trafficking in terms of factories and sweatshops, especially here in Northern California. We have a huge agricultural industry, and not only does that take place in the fields, but also food packaging and sorting and all those different things. We've seen cases involving overseers that are abusive to their employees. If their employee gets hurt, if their limbs get mangled in the machinery, they tell them to keep working. And they keep a gun at their waist so that nobody questions them. So these are the types of situations that we're seeing here and now and in California. So what are some of the indicators of labor trafficking? How do we know, or how do we even begin to have clues about, is there a labor trafficking situation happening? So some of the things that we've already talked about, but we'll talk more in detail, is that person living and working in the same place? That's very, very important. We see that in terms of restaurant work where people, their housing is connected to their employment. So guess what? That's also a form of psychological coercion, because if that person decides to leave that job or if that person tries to escape, all of a sudden they're homeless. And for many of us, if we were to quit our job or if we were to decide to leave our job, it would not affect our housing. We could still go back home and we could live where we live, But for them, this is a huge risk that they are undertaking. This is literally trying to escape a situation because their living is connected to their work. And so they can't leave one without the other. And then we also see that their communication is restricted or controlled. Oftentimes they're chaperoned. There's people who are nearby, making sure that they don't talk to strangers, making sure that they don't talk to anyone who may have the potential to help them. And oftentimes, traffickers will use reputational harm. We talked about that in terms of domestic minor sex trafficking. Will they use social media and Facebook and all those different things to destroy that person's reputation? With labor trafficking, oftentimes they'll talk to their friends or clients and customers of the business and say, oh, don't believe whatever so-and-so tells you. They're crazy. They're on drugs, or they're doing this, or they're doing that, in order to destroy that person's reputation so they can't get help from anyone else. This is a tactic that traffickers use in order to keep people under their control. And so they also have behaviors of fear, anxiety. They may not have anyone really that they talk to about what's going on. They lack standard health and safety. So a lot of times we'll see in terms of labor trafficking, a complete lack of standard health, safety in terms of where they live and where they work. And so there's often a lot of times that lack there, and that person doesn't have access to their basic needs, to medical, any of those things. For example, we've seen cases of people who are forced to live in an auto body shop where there's no bathroom. So what they do is they take a bucket and fill it with water, and that's how they take a bath. And so these are inhumane conditions that that person is forced to live in. They also have peculiar security settings or things that look suspicious. For example, in terms of sex trafficking, we've seen in massage parlors that have multiple security cameras, and once you go into the front of the massage parlor, you have to get buzzed in order to go to the back rooms. All the back rooms have locked doors, and so obviously these are not massage parlors that or massage establishments that just offer massage. These are massage establishments that offer much more than that, and in exchange, a lot of times these women are being victimized and forced into the commercial sex industry. A lot of times they're not in control of their own identification documents, including passports. We had a domestic servitude case involving someone who had multiple attempts at escaping, but one of the things that they did not want to leave without was their passport. And so one day she was cleaning the bathroom and she found her passport in the toilet tank. And so once she found her passport, she was able to make an attempt at escaping and was successful. And so oftentimes these people, their identity documents are taken away. And that's true not only of foreign nationals, but also of U.S. citizens. Oftentimes we take for granted our driver's license, our social security number, all the things that identify and connect us to our identity. Oftentimes with victims of trafficking, their identities are completely stripped away from them. They're given a different name, a different ID. They're told that if a police officer stops you, you say that you're 21 and that this is your name, here's your fake ID, or your ID is taken away and you have no ID at all. These are the things that traffickers will do, is strip a person of their identity. And they'll also owe a large debt and not be able to pay it off. They're performing odd tasks at odd hours. One of the things that I've noticed is that there's a lot of psychological coercion. And so what the traffickers will do is they'll humiliate these victims in order to keep the victims under their control. Oh, you forgot to feed the dogs today? Well, guess what? Today you're going to eat dog food. It's those types of things. It's, oh, you forgot to wash my car? Well, it's 2 a.m. Go wash my car. So performing odd tasks at odd hours, something just doesn't fit right about that situation. And so a lot of times it's just being an aware person in the community that really makes the difference in terms of a victim being able to be identified. So how do we even begin to communicate with victims? With labor trafficking, we talk about, how did you get this job? Well, I had this debt that I couldn't pay off, or, I was in a desperate situation because I just got here and I didn't know where to look for work. My family told me about this job. So there's all types of ways that someone gets recruited into a labor trafficking situation. And so we asked them, how did you get this job? We asked them, was this a job you were promised or expected? Did you talk to them about how many hours you would work or what your pay would be? Were you hourly, or, what was the agreement that you had there? What were you told about this job prior to starting? What would happen if you were to leave? Again, for most of us, if we were to leave our job, we would look for another one. We would have options. For many of these victims, if they were to leave their job and we ask them that question, they say, oh, if I were to stop working, they would kill my family in Honduras. If I were to stop working, they told me I would get deported. If I were to stop working, then I would be homeless. These are the types of answers that we get in terms of human trafficking. And so we ask them about their living conditions, their working conditions, and have they suffered physical or witnessed abuse? These are all important questions that we ask. And so we pretty much have covered labor trafficking, and now we're going to look more towards what does sex trafficking look like here in California, and specifically in Northern California. So one of the images that you see is a young girl with a tattoo on the inside of her lip. And you may be thinking, what in the world is that? Who would get a tattoo on the inside of their lip? Well, this is a practice that is called branding. And so oftentimes pimps, traffickers will brand their street name or the girl's street name on their lip, on their eyebrow, on their chest. They will put a tattoo that shows, this girl's my property. That's basically what that practice is about. On the other side of that picture, you'll see a residential brothel. And we've mentioned that residential brothels are houses in the middle of neighborhoods. So oftentimes people don't know what's going on. They may suspect, oh, they're probably selling drugs out of that house because there's people constantly coming and going. But what can oftentimes be going on is they will, for example, recruit consumers for that residential brothel at public places using a fake business or a fake business card, and then recruit people to come to that residential brothel. And oftentimes, like I said, that person, oftentimes they're called a John or a consumer, will pay money to that house, and oftentimes the girl never sees any type of money. So there's a complete lack of control in terms of residential brothels. And oftentimes they're moved from residential brothel to residential brothel. So they're very hard to track and to investigate. We also see sex trafficking in terms of massage parlors, women who are brought from Korea, from China, and oftentimes they're smuggling debt to get from their country of origin all the way to the United States, $10,000, $20,000 easily. And so they're told that they have to pay that back by working at the massage parlor and basically being forced into prostitution until they can pay off that debt. And on top of it, they keep adding, we're giving you food, we're giving you clothes, we're giving you all these things, and you have to pay even a house fee in order to get you these clients. And so that person becomes like a slave because they are never able to pay off that debt. And then we also have street prostitution. And so that's women and young girls who are forced into prostitution on the street. And then we're going to go to the next slide and see how are they recruited. Oftentimes there's direct recruitment. Like I said, there's a Romeo pimp, someone who engages them, romances them, convinces them that they're in love with them and they care about them. And so there's that kind of romance. And oftentimes they take advantage of girls who never had that in their life. For example, foster youth. For example, they'll pick on younger girls, girls in the middle school, types of age groups, and we'll get more into some of the statistics in a minute. But they'll pick on vulnerable girls and convince them that this is love, that this is what they want, that this is where they belong. And so there's that brainwashing type of activity that goes on. There's a guerrilla pimp, or someone who forces that person to engage in the commercial sex industry through violence, through assault, all those different types of things, kidnapping. And then there's peer recruitment, and that's less known about. So, for example, I've had a case involving a young girl who was recruited by another young girl from her group home. She was a foster youth. And so the young girl at her group home said, "Hey, let's go to a party. I want you to meet my boyfriend." So, of course, this teenager didn't think anything of it. Of course, I want to go to a party. Let's run away and go to a party. So she ended up going to this party, meeting the boyfriend, and then she was pimped out for 4 months until she ran away and hitchhiked her way back home. And when she got back home, her foster parents didn't want her. So we see pimp, peer types of recruitment all the time. And it's very important to realize that this can be male and female. There can be recruitment from female to female. There can be recruitment male to female. The gender dynamics there are pretty broad. And so we're going to move on to some myths. And we're seeing more and more of a paradigm shift in terms of how we think about these victims and how we think about this crime in general. A more traditional mindset is that prostitution is a victimless crime. I've often heard it say, they're just two consenting adults. What's the big deal, right? So we hear this often, that, prostitution is a victimless crime. But when we hear the stories and when we look at the statistics, we see overwhelmingly a lot of the women who are involved in prostitution have usually some type of crime in their background, whether it be child abuse or sexual assault, something that can be severely traumatizing that led up to that person being in that industry. Not always, but in my personal experience as a victim advocate, that is most often what I have seen. Another myth is that people freely choose prostitution, or that trafficking victims freely choose prostitution. And going back to the first conversation we had about the definition, in order for that person to be a victim of human trafficking, there has to be that element of force, fraud, and coercion. So any person who is being trafficked absolutely is being kept there because of one of those elements. There is no choice in it. And more than likely, there is something preventing them from getting out of that situation. And so are they victim or are they suspects? This is a very difficult paradigm that we live in, because both for youth, so in the juvenile delinquency system, and for adults, prostitution is a crime. And so oftentimes these young girls will get picked up by police officers, by patrol officers, and they will be put in jail. And guess who comes to bail them out? They're traffickers. And so to the traffickers, it's, okay, you cost me this much in bail money, guess what? Your quota just went up. And so it's something that can perpetuate that system. And so oftentimes, we're stuck in this paradigm of, is that person a suspect? Well, if they are a suspect, then of course we're going to arrest them and prosecute them. But if they're a victim, that shifts the way that we deal with them, that shifts the way that we engage with them. Now, and I'm going to speak about Sacramento because this is the region where we operate. Now we're seeing more patrol officers, more law enforcement, and even the juvenile delinquency system and probation seeing these young girls as victims and trying to connect them to services rather than prosecuting them or being punitive in the system and punishing these girls for what's happened to them. So some of the myths also are that prostitution is exciting and glamorous. I have talked to girls where they said, at first he bought me the latest phone and he bought me the latest designer bag, and, I've never had nice things in my life. And so this made it exciting to me. It made it glamorous. But it's interesting. You will talk to these young women and these girls, and they may have the latest phone and the latest bag, but you ask them, when was the last time you ate? And they say, 3 days ago. So it's this It's this myth that prostitution is exciting and glamorous and offers you money, but at the same time, the person who's controlling your money is this pimp, this trafficker, and more than likely you never see a dime of it unless he decides you see a dime of it. And so really, they don't have power or control. They can't get out whenever they want to. That is a myth. That is an illusion that they can get out whenever they want to. So some realities. At least 100,000 children are being exploited every year in the United States. The average age of entry is 12 to 14 years old. A lot of times they are recruited by someone who is posing as a boyfriend, a caretaker, a protector. We see child sex trafficking happening with pimp-controlled prostitution, familial prostitution, or familial trafficking. What does that mean? It means family members who will recruit their nieces, their cousins, their whoever into the commercial sex industry. I've seen it multiple times, and they'll recruit a family member to come work at a nightclub, come work at a strip club, and it gets them groomed into the commercial sex industry. So how do we identify these victims? Oftentimes there's a history of running away, frequently changing locations, numerous foster care placements. They may have a lot of frequent STIs or frequent pregnancies. They may have some mental health concerns, substance abuse. A lot of the young women have substance abuse issues. They're trying to self-medicate. They're trying to either block out what happened to them or be numb. We have a lot of conversations about, I just want to be numb. I just don't want to feel. So then they'll get high or they'll drink, whatever helps them not to feel. There's homelessness, there's prior histories of abuse, school absentees, all those different types of things. A lot of times we'll get calls from the school systems themselves saying, so-and-so hasn't shown up to school maybe once or twice in the past month. This is what we think is going on. Can you respond? And so these are also some ways of identifying. So what are some contributing factors? What are some things that contribute to a person ending up in this type of situation? Oftentimes there's economic conditions and poverty. A lot of women and girls who are growing up in impoverished situations, both abroad and domestically, we see that poverty is one of the things that keeps people or that can lure people into this type of situation because they think it's easy money, it's fast money, or it's a way out of the poverty type conditions that they're in. And so I've definitely seen what this looks like in an urban context. You can have a young girl who is born and raised here in the United States, but is not doing good at school, and then meet somebody who promises her all this type of money, and she sees it as a chance to get out the ghetto. And so this is something that we see all the time. Political conditions, unrest, war, exposure to violence. And this is not just violence within the home. That also is a contributing factor, but also community violence is a factor in a person being vulnerable to trafficking, lack of educational opportunities, and lack of value for women and children. These are all contributing factors. And it becomes almost an attitude or a mindset. I've been told I'm a pretty girl and I can make a lot of money. If this is all I'm good for, or this is what I believe, that this is what I'm good for, this is what I'm going to do. So this is all a contributing factor. So now that we've talked about some identifying factors, we're going to talk about what are the hurdles, what are the things that can keep a person from leaving or escaping this type of situation. And also, what are some of the hurdles for identifying these victims? So human trafficking, that concept or that term is maybe 15 years old from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. So our language and our understanding and our paradigm of human trafficking is still fairly new. And very rarely have I had a person be self-identify and say, oh, me, I'm a victim of trafficking. Very rarely. Most often, we'll get a referral from a domestic violence organization, from a child abuse organization, and they'll say, we have someone who's a victim of domestic violence, but then they started describing how their trafficker or how their abuser never let them leave the house, how their abuser didn't let them talk to family members, how he took all of her money and then threatened to deport her. We think maybe, just slightly, she could be a victim of trafficking. And it's that suspicion, it's that crossover that helps us to think through, okay, could this person be a victim of human trafficking when it's coming from another source? When it's coming from the victim themselves, oftentimes they'll have some type of primary trauma. It'll be the domestic violence or child abuse. With domestic violence, oftentimes they'll talk about those violent incidences, and that'll be the first thing that's at the forefront of their mind. But they may not necessarily mention the fact that they also worked for 7 years without pay in their husband's or abuser's restaurant. And so that can constitute elements of labor trafficking. With child abuse, for example, we've gotten referrals from CPS from children who are brought from abroad here and told they're going to go to school, and they end up being domestic servants in someone's home. The primary thing that they're looking at as child abuse is the fact this child never got to go to school, this child was burned with an iron, all these things that make it child abuse. But when we start to talk to the child and the reasons why they came and the dynamics that were going on in the home, it can end up being a human trafficking case. So I imagine that for all of you that are dealing with victim claims, oftentimes we'll have somebody probably claiming for domestic violence or child abuse or one of these other things, but it could be very likely that there's also some elements of human trafficking within their case. So to show you even more the crossover, we're going to go to the power and control wheel. And this should be very familiar for those of you who deal with domestic violence cases. Oftentimes we'll see the use of power and control in order to keep a person in these types of situations. And so there'll be the use of economic control. That person won't have access to money. That person won't have access to their bank accounts. That person won't be able even to talk to people who could potentially let them borrow money. All of those different things, that's economic abuse. Well, those same things that happen in domestic violence also translate to human trafficking, whether it's in the commercial sex industry, where a girl who's being trafficked or prostituted is not allowed to keep any of the money that she makes. That economic abuse also happens in human trafficking. Or with labor trafficking, it's not being paid what they said they were going to be paid. It's relying on someone else to meet their every need. All these things that we see in terms of domestic violence and the tactics that are used in those types of crimes are also used in trafficking. So we can take a look at that, or you can look at that further on your own time, but I also want to move on and look also at the tactics that traffickers use. And so one of the things that they do is they demoralize their victims. They deprive them of alternatives. And part of that is very psychological. In terms of the commercial sex industry and sex trafficking, they'll tell them, you're a hoe, you're nothing but a hoe, you're always going to be a hoe. And so if you hear that day in and day out, 365 days a year, it's very hard for that person not to believe it. And so there comes a point where that young woman, that young girl, believes it. And so they demoralize that victim. They deprive them of alternatives. And so when we get them for the first time and we're asking them, oh, what are your goals? Do you want to get a GED? Do you want to, finish your high school? They're like, what do you mean? Like, I can go to beauty school, or I can finish my GED. And we have to start to undo all of that and say, you do have options, you do have alternatives, because this person has been completely deprived of any alternatives in their life. And so they also use deprivation. They'll deprive them of sleep, they'll deprive them of food, they'll deprive them of contact with outsiders, and all of that deprivation affects a person because they really start to believe that they are not deserving of these things, or they don't deserve to be treated in a way that's humane, because they begin to normalize or try to rationalize the exploitation. Much like domestic violence, a lot of times women will be convinced that, oh, I provoked him and that's why he hit me, or I did something that made that person angry, and so that's what led up to this violent incident. And so a lot of times we'll see these odd relationships between a trafficker and a victim. Beyond just the pimp-victim dichotomy, we'll also see traffickers and victims where the victim believes, oh, he's like a father to me, or she's like a mother to me. And so they start to put these people in the place of where family relationships should be, and so then they start to believe all the things that they're told. Where he told me I can't get a job anywhere else, so I'm going to keep working here. Or he told me he sees me like a son, and one day I'm gonna run this business. So again, it's that fraud that keeps a person in this situation, because they keep believing that there are no alternatives, and they keep believing that the situation is going to get better, and it doesn't. And so we see that there's a lot of hurdles for the victim, whether it's culture or language or depression. We also see learned helplessness. They start to realize, well, things are not going to get any better, so why try? We also have seen that type of perspective. They have trauma. They have all these different elements that are going on. They feel shame. They blame themselves. They say, much like a person who has been in a domestic violence situation, I should have known better, or my family told me from the start that this wasn't going to be a good relationship. I should have known better. It's my fault for letting it go on for so long. Well, oftentimes with trafficking situations, we'll hear the same type of thing. I should have known better, or, this person, I should have known from the beginning that they were no good. So they start to blame themselves and believe that it's their fault. And they experience shame, especially depending on their cultural background. They will experience a lot of shame if they go back home, or if their family in their home country or their neighborhood knew what they were engaging in. So as a mental health professional, I will speak to mental health. And so we do see post-traumatic stress disorder, and we see complex trauma, meaning that person oftentimes has experienced multiple traumatic situations. For example, I had a 19-year-old that was a victim of sex trafficking, and when she described to me her first pimp that she had when she was 14, she talked about it like she was talking about what she had for lunch. She's like, yeah, I came to this country when I was 7, my uncle molested me, and so then I was in CPS, and I ran away from a couple of foster care placements. Then I met my first pimp, and he was really mean, but then, then I moved on, and then there was this other pimp, and now I'm doing this on my own. Like it was nothing, no emotion, nothing registered on her face. And it's because this, when someone experiences so many traumatic events, to really go back and remember will cause them too much trauma. And so oftentimes what they'll do is they'll escape. So we call this disassociation. So they talk about it like they're talking about what they had for lunch, or they're not really in the room with you when they're talking about this. Their mind is somewhere else. Their mind is focusing on something else. They're like a robot that's telling you what happened. Because oftentimes they do have to talk to multiple people. They have to talk to CPS. They have to talk to law enforcement. They have to talk to the psychologist. They have to talk to the counselor. And so by the time they get to a victim advocate, they've seen it all. They've talked to 1 million people. This is the 30th time that they've told their story. So why be present in their own story? Why engage emotionally in their own story when it costs them too much? And so in order to survive, they kind of check out when they're telling their story. And it's hard because as victim advocates, as law enforcement, if someone is not really engaged in what they're talking about, a lot of times then they're not believed, right? Or a lot of times they're perceived to be lying because their emotional response does not match what they're talking about. We also see depression. And what that looks like. For example, I've had a client who wouldn't show up to appointments or had very poor hygiene. And if you just saw them on the street, you would think, oh, this person's just sloppy and disorganized and disheveled. But in reality, they've been through so much that this just comes out as depression. And it's hard because as victim advocates, at times we do a lot for clients and we want them to be engaged in the process, but they may be so depressed that they don't even have it in them, or they may not even be ready to engage in those services because they're so depressed. And also there's psychological and developmental disabilities. This is probably one of the most difficult and horrendous things, is oftentimes kids, young adults, and adults with developmental disabilities are vulnerable and are targeted for trafficking. And so guess what? Then they have even more limited abilities in being able to tell their story and engage in the system, because oftentimes they don't even have the capacity that we all have to be able to engage and articulate what has even happened to them. I remember having a victim who was in his late 30s, early 40s, but had the mind of a 7-year-old. And when describing his situation, all he could say was, I was sold and I had to work. And if I didn't work, they would beat me. So we couldn't ask him where this happened or what was the name of the person who did this to you. I mean, he couldn't recall those details, and he didn't know that he should have recalled those details because in his mind, he's like a 7-year-old. And so we see all of those challenges in terms of mental health. And then even if a person doesn't have these mental health concerns or issues, there are other challenges in identifying them. First is trust. The first story that they tell is probably not going to be the whole truth because they've been so drilled into them that if they told anybody, these ramifications were going to happen. So what you're going to get the first time around is probably not the whole story. Trained or canned responses, not getting a real age or a real name or what really was going on. A lot of times when I've engaged with young adults or youth that are in the commercial sex industry, they'll say, oh, I wanted to do this. Or, this was, I don't want to get him in trouble, but I love him. And, we agreed that this is what was going to happen. You're 16, you're 15, you're 17, you can't agree to this. And so it takes an amount of time for that person to even see that they were victimized, to see that this person took advantage of them. And so that thought process takes some time. And that is also an initial challenge, that they don't see themselves as a victim. And quite honestly, they're not always likable. If you're the person who's trying to get them services, but they see this as a choice, as something that they agreed to, or something that they're doing because they love their boyfriend and they don't want to get their boyfriend in trouble, they're going to tell you to get out their face, to F off, that this is not your business or your problem. And so when dealing with youth, this is something that we very much so encounter. And it's hard to really engage and stick with that person so that you can build that trust and so that that person really does tell you the whole story. And then there's always cultural and language barriers. How that person engages with the system. Do they even want to engage with the system? I can't even tell you how many times I've had victims tell me, I don't want to go to a therapist. Therapists are for crazy people, and I'm not crazy. I've had a lot of bad things happen, but I'm not crazy. And so it's overcoming this cultural understanding of what mental health is, what therapy does, and how that person can actually use these tools to help that person move forward with their life. So when we think about a survivor's path is all over the place. Sometimes first they're picked up by law enforcement. Sometimes they're coming to us from a school counselor. Sometimes they don't speak English. Sometimes they've been here since their age of 2 and they speak English perfectly. So their path is very non-linear. And I think oftentimes as victim advocates or victim services professionals, we think of things in very linear processes. We think of the criminal justice system and we see, oh, first this person reports to the police, and then there's an investigation that's opened, and then once evidence is gathered, then there's charges that are brought, and then there's prosecution, and there's this linear process that we think that victims go through. But when it comes to survivors of human trafficking, the process is very non-linear because their path is all over the place. Do they have a place to live? How can they cooperate with an investigation if they don't even have a place to stay or live? And so oftentimes we're trying to do everything at once and get that person's story, connect them with services, stabilize that person, reunite them with family if that's what they want. I mean, it's all over the place. And our systems are just coming to understand how nonlinear the paths that these victims take is. And now we're starting to think, okay, we have to shift some of our paradigms. We have to shift some of our systems in order to accommodate what these victims really need. So I'm going to give some case examples, and you have these in front of you. And we're going to do a little bit of interaction here. And so we're going to take a second to read these case examples, and then we're going to have some discussion of what we think these cases are. So why don't we take a minute? So, looking at Melanie's case, what are some of the elements using the AMP model, the action means purpose? What are some of the elements that we see that meet the definition of human trafficking? We're putting our critical thinking hats on. What are some of the elements of this case that make it human trafficking or that don't make it human trafficking?
Her age.
Her age. Okay, so we see that at the time that this is happening, that she is 14. Okay, so legally, she is under the age of 18. Any other factors that we see? Don't be shy now. Isolation. Would you like to say more about isolation?
Well, it doesn't look like she really had a supportive environment around her, so it seems like it was just her and her boyfriend, and she felt like in order to please him or satisfy him, she had to do what he wanted so that she wouldn't be further alone.
So in terms of the elements, what would that be? Okay, I'm hearing coercion. Okay.
She was recruited
She was recruited.
by her boyfriend
Yes.
with a coercion because he basically told her that they need money, and then she ended up having commercial sex.
So then the commercial sex is our purpose, right? So she's engaging in that industry so they can make money to survive. Although it's not clear here if who got to keep the money, but we can keep going. Are there other elements of this case? So it was mentioned about the economic abuse. We don't know if she got to keep the money or not.
But we're assuming most likely no, correct?
We're assuming no. Mm-hmm. Anything else about this case that may or may not make it trafficking? Okay, so far we have recruitment. She was recruited by her boyfriend. we have some type of coercion in that she's afraid of leaving, and some fraud in the sense that she believes that he loves her and that, if, she loves him, then she'll do this for him. And then we have a purpose in that she is in the commercial sex industry, and we're assuming that she doesn't keep the money. And add to that, she is under the age of 18, so we don't really even need to look at force, fraud, and coercion. So yes, this very well could be a case of human trafficking. So I'm glad that we have this discussion, because when this girl gets picked up in reality and she is 14, they're probably not going to have as much information as what's on the screen. And so there's a lot of additional questions that we should be asking. So what are some of those additional questions that we would want to ask Melanie?
How she got involved.
How she got involved. How did she meet this guy?
Does she get to keep any of the money?
Does she get to keep any of the money?
Does she enjoy it?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it against her will?
Is she being forced, or is there something forcing her to engage in this? I wonder how old this guy is. If he's 21, if he's 22, and he's dealing with a 14-year-old, then you can just tack on a lot more charges. Is he a student at her school?
We know, at least here in Sacramento, a lot of high school girls are approached by older men who come on campus.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. And I'm going to warn you, they get progressively more difficult. Okay, so now that we're looking at Jose's case, what are some of the elements that are present here that could make this a trafficking case or not make it a trafficking case? And I also want to mention that for the people who are online, they can also type in comments for the chat. But we talked about economic abuse. Can you say more about that?
Well, he's claiming that he is promising he's going to give him, what was it, a trailer or something, and I believe money or something, and obviously he didn't, because when he threatened, Jose threatened to quit, the trafficker threatened to call immigration, so he's using that scare tactic to intimidate him also.
So the two things that you emphasize, that economic abuse, that would be fraud, because there's that promise that he's going to get paid and he's not being paid. And then there's that coercion, which is the threats of deportation or threats to report him to the police.
Sarush, any comments from?
No, it's the problem is it's kind of hard to read because they're trying to.
Okay, we'll continue with here at headquarters.
Okay.
Okay, so we see some power and control.
It's trying to, they're gonna call the police, they're gonna call the immigration, and I think he doesn't have any, he's undocumented, so he got scared.
Mm-hmm.
So he got, the power of the employer, whoever's that employer, get him not to leave the was doing.
Right. Do we see any actions here? We have a hand.
He recruited him through his former employer, and then he kept him in a hidden security gates, all that.
Absolutely. So again, that person is being recruited by someone that they know and trust. There's some harboring going on, and that he is living where he is working. And then with all those security measures, that can also be seen as physical confinement. And so that person is forced to stay on those premises. Anything else that we see with Jose's case? So, what are some additional questions we would ask Jose?
His hours, like how long he was working a day, and if he was free to leave, basically. We know he wasn't. But
Right. So it's very important, especially with labor trafficking, to distinguish between labor exploitation and labor trafficking. So we look at what are the hours did he work? Was he able to work an 8-hour day and then go to his trailer and have some privacy and put his feet up and watch TV? Or did he have to continue working around the clock or whenever his boss or employer wanted him to do something? Right. Right, so that's something we would ask him. Did you get what was promised to you? Yeah. Great. So we have one more. So do we have any elements here of human trafficking in Ada's case?
Next thing is demoralizing her by making her work and sleep in the garage. So there's 2 tactics there, I think. Oh, fraud, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a fraud tactic there, and he says, come to the United States, I'll give you a good life. And in reality, this is probably not the life that she thought she was going to have. What other elements do we see here?
Social isolation. She doesn't get to leave without an escort.
So she's chaperoned. She doesn't get to leave on her own. And so this can also be a tactic that is used as an action, right? Keeping her isolated.
Transporting her.
Transporting her. So if he facilitated her coming from her country of origin, absolutely, he transported her. You have a hand over here.
She was forced based on the physical abuse of her husband.
Okay, so if she didn't cook, clean, and do all the domestic duties, she was abused. And so that could be an example of force. Is there a purpose here? Using the AMP model?
They gave her any money.
Okay, I heard some people say labor. So he is saving money, essentially, by not paying her. So with this case, it's a little bit more ambiguous, because couldn't you also say that if someone is a spouse, they're going to do some domestic duties in general? So what makes this any different? Okay, so I heard someone in the audience say that he forces her to sleep in the garage. So she is being treated not as a family member, she is being treated as a servant. Now, with this case, I'm going to disclose there's a discrepancy at times between what can be identified as human trafficking versus what is prosecuted. So this case, though identified as a victim of human trafficking, what was prosecuted as with the evidence of beyond a reasonable doubt was the domestic violence. Are there any additional questions that we would ask Ada?
But did she get any money from the family? Did she have any money on herself?
Right. Did she ever get any type of money?
Did they threaten her with taking her passport away, or her immigration status was threatened by the family?
Right. So were there threats of deportation? Did she get to keep her identification documents? Again. And these are things that are seen in both domestic violence and human trafficking. So for our law enforcement and our prosecutors, at times it's a very fine line between those two crimes. And as victim advocates, it's a very fine line between these two crimes. So now we're going to go to the social services that are available for victims. So for the social services that are available for victims, nationwide, there is what is called the National Human Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, NHTVAT for short. And that national program exists to serve foreign national victims of human trafficking. And Opening Doors is a service provider for foreign nationals. And so through that national project, we're able to serve those foreign national victims and provide them with housing and support and victim advocacy. And so that is a little bit about what those social service providers are able to do, including Opening Doors. There are a lot of other service providers that also serve domestic victims, and those exist both locally, throughout the state, and nationally. And at the end, we'll have some phone numbers and additional resources pertaining to those populations. But what's very important is the model of services to this population. Like I said, we're still coming into an understanding of the psychology of these victims, and then also how our services can best address those needs and what type of models we need to employ. For our services at Opening Doors, we really look at a victim-centered model, and so having that victim be at the center along with their advocate or their case manager, and then providing them with these wraparound type of services of housing and counseling and English as a second language courses and transportation, and getting them those identity documents, because a lot of times when they leave these situations, they are literally leaving with the clothes on their back. And so how do we help them regain that sense of identity? How do we help them start over? And really focusing on their strengths. After someone has been in this type of situation for so long, they are completely demoralized. And so to have someone focus on, these are their strengths, these are the things that they're good at, it starts to rebuild some of that dignity in themselves and that self-respect. When we do an intake or needs assessment, we always ask them, what are some of the things that you're good at? And that's the question that takes them the longest to answer, because a lot of times they don't know what they're good at. They didn't even think they could be good at anything. And so it's part of that process of helping that person regain that sense of self. In the state of California, we also have public benefits available for victims of human trafficking. And so for a person who's a foreign national under SB 1569, which was passed in 2006, they're eligible for cash aid, food stamps, Medi-Cal, and they're also eligible for that for 8 months. And then once they received what's called a T visa, they're eligible for 8 additional months. Now, for domestic victims of human trafficking, there are benefits available to them in that they meet the eligibility requirements for other populations. For example, if you have a foster youth who has been a victim of trafficking, as a foster youth, they are entitled to certain benefits, certain public benefits. And so oftentimes it's easier to engage other things that they may be eligible for, and not necessarily the fact that they are a victim. It really depends on the situation. If they have children, if they don't have children, all those different types of elements. So now, briefly, I'm going to talk about immigration relief. And so for foreign nationals, there are 3 or 4 main options for immigration relief. The first one is the Violence Against Women's Act, also known as VAWA. And this option is specifically for victims who are married to a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident. And what this does is allow the person to apply for themselves instead of relying on that abusive partner or spouse to apply for them. So in Ada's case, once she escaped, she was eligible to apply for VAWA, one, because there was a lot of evidence of the domestic violence, and for VAWA, you just need to prove substantial abuse or harm to that person. And then she's eligible to go straight for a green card because she was married to a U.S. citizen. These are some of the positives of the VAWA option. And then we come to the U visa. The U visa is for a person who was a victim of crime in the United States, and it covers about 25 different crimes. So sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence. There are now more workplace crimes that are also covered under the U visa. And so what this U visa does is for a person who is an immigrant and they are a victim of crime, they're eligible to apply for this visa, and if they are helpful in the investigation. So this is often the hardest part because a lot of times they don't want to come forward, they don't want to report to law enforcement because they're scared of the deportation. And so this is for those who have been helpful in investigation and cooperated with the investigation. With an approval of a U visa, they're eligible to stay in the country for 4 years and work, and then they can adjust to become a legal permanent resident, and so on. So the biggest obstacle with the U visa is every year Congress has allocated around 10,000 U visas to be allocated to immigrant victims of crime. Every year that cap is reached within a few months because there's so many immigrant victims of crime, and there is a very limited number that's allotted by Congress. And so among the U visa crimes, there's also trafficking. But independent of the U visa, there's the T visa. And this visa is specifically designed for victims of trafficking. It says it's recommended to cooperate with law enforcement, but it's not strictly required as it is with the T visa. And so it does some of the same things as the U. It provides a path to citizenship. After it's filed, they're eligible for extended public benefits, employment authorization. The thing with both the T and the U visa is oftentimes it takes a long time. I can tell you from personal experience, I've seen T visas take anywhere from 6 months to 3 years. It depends on how much evidence we have and just the process with these applications. There are other options. For example, a person who has cooperated with federal law enforcement can be granted continued presence, and that's something that's issued strictly by law enforcement. For a child who was abused here in the United States, there's also special immigrant juvenile status. That is something that they can apply for. And then there's also deferred action for childhood arrivals, and that is also known as DACA, and that is for children who were brought here from a young age and meet certain requirements for that option. So to talk about some resources in California, I've briefly mentioned Opening Doors. There's also the Grace Network, which has done extensive work in the state of California to connect various resources that are available for victims and their family members. There's also My Sister's House, which is our local domestic violence and human trafficking resources and shelter. And then there's also CAST, which is the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking. They are based in Los Angeles, but they actually run the California hotline for human trafficking. And so that is that 888-539-2373 number. And so CAST runs the California hotline and also can provide technical assistance to those who have encountered a victim and are in need of assistance with that. And then there's also the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And so this is the national hotline. And this is what we promote the most because it is 24 hours. They know the local providers. they have really great relationships with the local providers, and they're 24 hours a day. And so that is a great resource on a nationwide level. And that number is 1-888-3737-888.